Hello, everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review. A surprising turn of events, dozens of countries joining Israel in a boycott against the UN's controversial Durban summit, the conference on combating racism, ironically mired with a history of anti-Semitism. But things didn't exactly go as the boycotters expected. Durban 4, held on the 20th anniversary of the first anti-racism conference, was a fairly empty affair at the UN on Wednesday. 34 nations co-signing onto an Israeli-led boycott of the event over its repeated history of delving into openly anti-Semitic rhetoric. United States Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, for one, saying that the United States is committed to working on the issue of racism, but will do so in a more, quote, inclusive setting, adding that Washington still holds concerns over the summit's results and faults the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic underpinnings of the Durban process. All that said, much to the surprise of many, reports show that Israel was not even mentioned at this year's event. Rather, discussions shifting as they should to racial or religious discrimination, intolerance, and xenophobia in general, and issues like COVID vaccine disparities and recognition and reparations for injustices caused by slavery in particular. Criticism of Israel, meantime, instead patiently held for the UN General Assembly, and most comments focusing on the Israel-Palestinian conflict through arguments in favor of a negotiated two-state solution. Leaders from the United States, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia among the many calling for a return to talks, but others a little bit more radical. Iranian President Raisi accusing Israel of slaughtering women and children and of being the biggest sponsor of state terrorism. And Qatar, while on the one hand urging the world not to shun the Taliban, on the other hand, similarly accusing Jerusalem of numerous alleged human rights violations, including starting the May conflict between Israel and Hamas with repeated abuses of Muslim and Christian religious sites. Such accusations, however, are often levied at Israel without merit. The war in May of last year in particular being sparked by Hamas terrorists who indiscriminately fired over 4,000 missiles towards civilian communities in Israel, starting with the Old City in Jerusalem. And this escalation itself, while typically blamed on Israeli presence at the Temple Mount, in actuality started weeks before, with the collapse of Palestinian elections and a sharp rise in attacks against Jews, later dubbed the TikTok Intifada. The search is over. All 6 escapees from the Gilboa prison now reunited with Israeli security forces. And Prime Minister Naftali Bennett among the many hailing the sophisticated and impressive manhunt operations.
הלילה נסגר מעגל, נעצרו 2 המחבלים האחרונים שברחו מכלא גלבוע לפני שבועיים. 2 המחבלים נכנעו ויצאו החוצה ללא תגובה באש.
After nearly 2 weeks in the wind, the final pair of runaways from Israel's Gilboa prison, Iham Kamamji and Munadel Infayat, recaptured in the West Bank city of Jenin. The other 4 prisoners likewise arrested in pairs in Nazareth, Israel, last weekend. But the final 2, members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror group, were located in a house in eastern Jenin and were apprehended, along with 2 other men who were aiding them. According to intel reports, Kamamji and Infayat had been skipping from one safe house to the next for several days. The IDF, Israel Police, and ISA, however, hitting hard with a complex mission Saturday night. Police Commissioner Kobi Shabtai confirming that forces prepared for several days before getting the final signal to move in for the raid. And in fact, as part of the operation, Public Security Minister Omer Bar-Lev even misleading the Israeli public by saying in a televised interview Saturday night that at least one of the fugitives was believed still in Israel, when the IDF already knew that both were together in Jenin. This was a ploy to lull the suspects into a false sense of security after learning that they may have been using radios to keep tabs on the search efforts. Of course, that said, Bar-Lev also adding that the battle not yet over. Kamamji and Infayat only just now handed over for interrogation, and in the coming days, the government set to open a commission of inquiry into the escape itself. Prime Minister Bennett having already condemned the jailbreak as a wake-up call for the nation.
חלק ממערכות המדינה התנוונו בשנים האחרונות וצריכות לעבור תהליכים של תיקון, של ייעול, של חתירה למצוינות. את מה שהתקלקל אפשר לתקן.
Joining us now with more on the operation to recapture the final 2 Palestinian prison fugitives, former head of strategic planning for the IDF Central Command, Colonel Reserves, Dr. Danny Tielson. Dr. Tielson, thank you so much for being with us. Now, can you walk me through this operation? You know, what did it entail? Some of the details. How was it planned? How was it performed?
Well, thank you. The first thing is to have the cooperation between all our forces on the ground. The Secret Service, the IDF, the police, and even the civil administration, they are all working together in one control room, talking in the same language, making the operation from the ground and from the technical units that help the Secret Service to work. And all together, they're making one control room, as you can see in the picture. And in that control room, all the information is coming to one place and in the same language. At the moment that we are getting the right information about the place that these people are, we have, first of all, to see that we have the forces to do the operation as fast as we can and without people that will be harmed, not from the Palestinian side and of course not from our forces. So the special unit of the police that is called the Yamam, it's the anti-terror unit that they know how to work in very, very sharp, what we call strategic, we're calling it surgical way. We are coming inside the Palestinian area, isolating the houses that we think that the terrorists are there, and be sure that no one can get in, no one can get out. After we isolate the place, we call the people that are inside. Probably they are not waiting for us there, and we have to be sure that we are protected when we are doing this operation and trying to get inside with dogs or with robots, not with soldiers. The first thing that we are trying to do is to do it without soldiers, just to do it from outside. And in this particular operation, it works very good, because when the terrorists understand that they are close and they cannot get out, and the alternative is that the army is going to blow up the building and they will be killed. One of them called his father and he said that he's ready to give up, and that's the right thing and the best thing that we can dream of.
So I want to. So I want to interject here, because actually part of this operation, as I understand it, this came up recently, was that Omer Bar-Lev, the security chief, deceived Israel in order to deceive the terrorists. This was seriously reminiscent of the attack on the metro of tunnels in Gaza, by the way, where they amassed troops on the border to trick the Hamas into the tunnel in order to destroy it. So here again, we see Israeli security officials deceiving, willfully, knowingly deceiving the Israeli public in order to deceive Palestinian militants. Couldn't Bar-Lev have just said nothing? Was the deception necessary?
Yes, it was necessary, because otherwise the Palestinians will be around it and we cannot get to the place. The main idea was that the Palestinians would think that we are going to get inside the refugee camp, and you cannot do it unless you are really use your forces, using the media, using the public in the Israeli side, the Palestinian side, that everyone will believe that we are going to one place and really we're going to another place. And I think that was a very good idea. That's the way that the chief of staff of Israel, of the army, is using almost every time.
So just to continue on that, though, is that really, as you say, as you're suggesting, maybe the new face of the Israeli security modus operandi, you know, where authorities feel comfortable lying to the public because the ends justify the means?
It's not lying, it's cheating in a way, but it's not a lying. You know, you don't have to tell everything, but you have to make the picture. And if you are making the right picture for the public, it works. And as you can see here, it works very good because they were surprised. As you know, Jenin is not a small town, and everyone thought that we are going to the west side, and really these special forces went to the east side, and they succeeded to get to the house without fighting any Palestinian forces on the ground.
All right, Colonel Dr. Danny Tielson, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your insights on this operation with us.
Thank you. Bye.
In other news, just 24 hours after being cut from the Democrats' spending bill, a new separate bill to provide $1 billion for Israel's Iron Dome defense system already introduced to the United States Congress, and it's set for a vote later today. Chair of the U.S. House Appropriations Committee, Connecticut Democrat Rosa DeLauro, saying that the United States' commitment to the security of our friend and ally Israel is ironclad, and replenishing interceptors used to protect Israel from attacks is our legal and moral responsibility, end quote. Again, though, if every politician felt this way, then the aid likely wouldn't have been cut in the first place. Political analysts therefore awarding the so-called squad with a symbolic victory, adding that it's time to acknowledge how the supposed progressive wing in government holds more influence than it's given credit for. Joining with more is founder and president of the Jerusalem Washington Center, Gideon Israel. Gideon, thanks so much for joining us. Now, what is your initial reaction to the cutting and then reintroducing of this $1 billion in spending?
Well, from an Israeli perspective, I think it was quite odd to see how Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, immediately called Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, to find out what's going on. It seems as if like the Iron Dome, it has more of a central role in Israel's defense doctrine than it should. At the end of the day, it shoots down short-range or mid-range missiles. It shouldn't be such a big deal. Obviously, we want to know what's going on. Why was it cut? Why was it taken out of the bill? But it shouldn't be such a big deal that money for the Iron Dome was cut.
So now, I want to talk a little bit about the squad, as I mentioned earlier. The more liberal elements within the Democratic Party killed the provision for Israel, for this Israel aid in the larger spending bill. So even though a new bill has already been proposed, and it's likely to pass, many are arguing that they have far more sway than they're given credit for. How do you respond?
Well, it wasn't only the squad. I think there were other progressive elements in the Democratic Party who were against it. I think one was, for example, Pramelia Jayapal from Washington State, and other members, I think, of the Progressive Caucus who were also against this. But the reality is that the Democrats have a slim majority. When you have a slim majority and everything passes on partisan lines, then if 4 or 5 or 10 votes aren't there, then the bill dies. So it might be a symbolic victory because of the small majority that the Democrats have. But I think what happened is presents an opportunity for Israel to reassess the aid that they get from America. I mean, the aid that Israel is getting from America is in the same format as it's been for the past 35 years. A lot of things have changed in the past 35 years. Israel's economy is much stronger. In so many ways, Israel is so much stronger. And I think the current way that Israel receives aid in terms of cash coming to Israel, and even though most of it's spent back in the United States, I think it's time for Israel to reassess that aid. It should also be mentioned, I mean, we call it aid, but this is probably one of the better investments of the United States in foreign policy. We saw in Afghanistan how within a few weeks, $90 billion, which is roughly the same amount of money that Israel has received for the past 30 years, went down the drain as the Taliban got hold of all the weapons that were given to the Afghan army. So while we call it aid, it really is an investment, and it's a very good investment for America. Remember, no soldiers in Israel, less presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, so it's a very good investment for America.
All right, and very quickly, I know that the argument comes up all the time about how Israel is supposedly becoming a partisan issue, despite both Republicans and Democrats insisting that support is bipartisan. Is Israel becoming a partisan issue? Because it seems increasingly that it is.
It's not totally a partisan issue, but remember, I think in a recent Pew or Gallup poll, it said around 50% of Democrats supported a strong relationship with Israel. So obviously, there's much more Republican support than there is Democratic support. Remember, in 2015, when the Prime Minister of Israel came to the Congress and said that the Iran deal is an existential issue, please vote against it. Only 25 out of about 170 Democrats in the House of Representatives voted against it, and only 4 Democrats out of about 48 Democrats in the Senate voted against it. So there's obviously a lot more support from Israel on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. And in addition, we're seeing anti-Israel forces within the Democratic Party are much stronger than they were 10 years ago, not to mention 20 and 30 years ago.
Gideon Israel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on, Israel's ICUs filling up more and more, stretching resources thinner and thinner as coronavirus infections continuing to balloon. Another 6,000 infections confirmed overnight for a total of 69,000 active patients, 723 of whom are in serious condition, and the spread rate holding at about 5.6%, while the death toll rising to 7,592. Health Ministry Director General Nachman Ash then now calling to renew heavy restrictions on the public before the healthcare system can be overwhelmed.
אנחנו רוצים להתאים את ההגבלות שיש בחתונות למצבים אחרים שבהם יש התקהלויות המוניות. אנחנו מדברים על זה שבמתחם סגור לא יהיו מעל 400, במתחם פתוח לא יהיו מעל 500. אם התחלואה לא תרד, אני חושב שצריך לחזור לצעדים האלה.
Ash explaining that there's a limit to what the healthcare teams can do, and that the unvaccinated must go get inoculated as soon as possible, especially as younger Israelis without all 3 vaccinations and the unvaccinated are accounting for some 80% of COVID hospitalizations, nearly twice their relative share of the population. As for why the COVID cabinet hasn't met for 2 weeks to address these issues, however, Ash adding that the holidays likely precluded in-person meetings, but that the morbidity rate is by no means being overlooked.
אני לא חושב שהיא מתעלמת. יש הרבה צעדים שנעשים ויש הרבה חשיבה. יש אבל אמירה מאוד ברורה של הממשלה שהמשק רוצים שהוא יישאר פתוח, שמערכת החינוך תהיה פתוחה, שהתלמידים ילמדו ככל שניתן בצורה פרונטלית. זה ההנחיה של הממשלה, זאת ההחלטה שלה, ולפי זה פועלים. אבל יש הרבה צעדים של הבדיקות המהירות, של התו הירוק, אכיפה שנעשית, יש הרבה פעילות שנעשית כדי לנסות בתנאים האלה להתמודד עם זה.
Now for our final item tonight, we get reflective and repentant with the holiest day of the Hebrew year. Israelis and Jews around the globe celebrating Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, over the weekend.
We come in here every year at that time. This is like 3 days before Yom Kippur. We are launching a special traditional costume that we are coming here to the sea, to the beach, and we are throwing the scenes to the sea. This is a symbolic act. We are showing to the Lord that we are becoming a better person because we are throwing the scenes to the sea.
Millions of Jews preparing for the Yom Kippur high holiday last week, asking for forgiveness, donating to charity, confessing sins, and otherwise looking to purify themselves ahead of the annual 25-hour fast and extended prayer services. The holiday bringing with it a unique quiet as the typically bustling city streets fade into silent introspection. Nearly all drivers across the nation leaving their cars in the parking lot, and businesses and services all likewise grinding to a halt from Wednesday night to Thursday night, when the shofar is blown and the fast is finally broken. Far from the lockdowns that accompanied last year's Yom Kippur holiday, however, this year's observance returning mostly back to normal. Israelis from all walks of life, mostly children and particularly from the secular and non-Jewish demographics, taking to the streets with their scooters, bikes, and dogs without fear of being hit by the usual traffic, even on major highways or in crowded cities like Tel Aviv. And of course, with one holiday done, the next already up in rotation. Sukkot, aka the Feast of Booths, aka the Feast of Tabernacles, setting in Monday evening. Unlike Yom Kippur, though, which is a solemn and serious event, the week of Sukkot is a bit more lively. Marked by living in temporary dwellings and exposing oneself to the elements, Sukkot commemorates the Jews' biblical journey from Egypt to the Promised Land, and it's a holiday of joy and happiness. And to that end, without lockdowns looming overhead, the typical exhibitions, shows, concerts, and festivals seen during the week of Sukkot are back in full force. All one needs to attend is a mask and a green pass. Finally, before we go, it's time to learn some Hebrew with the latest of our limited weekly lessons from our friends at Ulpan O.
שלום, דינה מדברת.
שלום, אני רוצה לנסוע לישראל בספטמבר.
לאן אתה נוסע?
לתל אביב. אני מחפש מלון נחמד, קרוב לים ולמסעדות טובות.
יש לי מלון מצוין, מלון אור. קרוב מאוד לים וגם למסעדות ולבית קפה קטן ונחמד.
יופי! אולי יש גם קולנוע קרוב?
כן, יש קולנוע קרוב וגדול. אתה יכול לראות סרט כל יום אם אתה רוצה.
יופי! אני מאוד אוהב סרטים.
סרטים, מסעדות, בתי קפה, חנויות יפות, הכל קרוב למלון.
וואו! אולי יש גם בנק קרוב למלון? אם אני הולך כל יום לסרטים ולמסעדות, אני צריך כסף.
בטח, יש כמה בנקים קרוב מאוד למלון.
מצוין! אני רוצה שבוע במלון אור בתל אביב.
בסדר גמור.
And that's it for ILTV's weekly review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.